So another viewer questioned our sanding and finishing, and which was a question I had also. I know you sanded everything to begin with just to make the board flat.
Right. Yep.
But you also ran through all the grits after it was flat.
Right.
Is that a necessary step? I mean, we tend to sometimes cheat a little bit on our sanding and we skip grits and stuff.
Sure.
But in a case like this, is that maybe not the thing to do?
Yeah, it's important to, number one, to start with a rough grit. And the reason is we're working with two dissimilar materials. So in other words, we've got epoxy, which is probably a little softer than what the wood is, or vice versa, depending on what kind of wood you use. But you want to sand all of this with rough sandpaper, number one, so you can remove the material a little bit quicker. But number two, when you use rough sandpaper, it tends to take off both the epoxy and the wood at about the same rate. If you tried to do that with finer sandpaper, it may not take the EcoPoxy off quite as fast, and so you'd end up with a hump.
Oh.
So it's important to flatten the whole thing out with, we started with 80 grit. If you got maybe something's warped or you have extra epoxy on top, or let's say we underpoured and we had to sand away some of the wood, you could even start with a 60 grit, but we started with 80. And we stuck with that for quite a while till we got the entire thing flat. You'll notice even in the video down here we had a few divots where we underpoured slightly, so we kind of had to keep working that and getting it all down flat with the 80 grit first.
So it's important to make sure it's flat, and to do that, you're saying that 80 grit is what we want to do for that.
Right. Yep.
And once you get that flat, then it's starting to do the finish part of it.
Right. Then we actually get into the finish sanding part of it, and that's where you can go through all the different grits. If you'll remember, when we were using the 80 grit, we kept checking everything with a ruler,
right,
to see if it was flat.
Right.
And we kept marking all those high spots, and we just kind of kept track of that as we went through with the 80 grit. Well, just because you're done with the 80 grit, you're moving on to say the 100 grit, doesn't mean that you can't get off a little by sanding too much in one area. So to remedy that, we took a pencil, marked a pencil line across the entire top. That way we just kind of kept working in one area and moving our sander kind of back and forth until the pencil line disappears, and then you just kind of keep working down the board.
So you used an 80 grit to get it flat. We did the lines.
Yep.
And you sanded. You just kept sanding until you felt that, and you could tell that it was flat.
Mm-hmm.
And once that was, then we went from 80 to 100 to 120 to 150, 180, 220. I think on up to 320 grit.
Right.
Do we need to do all those grits? Sometimes, you tend to cheat and you skip a grit here and there.
Sure, yeah.
But on something like this, you wouldn't suggest that.
No, I think it's important that you do go through all those grits. And here's why. We're working with two different materials at this point. One being our lumber that we used for the work pieces, and then the EcoPoxy in the middle. So think of the EcoPoxy as being sort of a sheet of glass. It's probably going to reveal scratch marks much easier than what the wood will. In other words, you'll see them in the EcoPoxy itself.
Not to interrupt you, but I will say that when you were doing this, I did notice that EcoPoxy looked like just a colored frosted Plex for a while. And I think I even kept asking you, is this going away?
Right, exactly. So that's why we went on up to 320 to get all those scratch marks out. Because normally I might stop at like 220 or something on a typical woodworking project and then start to apply my finish. But we could still see a little bit of that frosted feel to the EcoPoxy itself at 220, so we did go on up to 320. I think you could actually go on up to 400 and even 600 if you really wanted to glass this out even smoother. But we stopped at 320 and then decided to just put one coat of finish on at that point. And it came out pretty nice at 320.
Yeah, it looks very nice. And like I said, I couldn't believe it to begin with, because I couldn't imagine you being able to sand this EcoPoxy, especially when it was looking like a brushed, diffused plexiglass, how that was ever going to have the color, but it sure came out.
You know, another tip, since we're going through so many different grits of sandpaper, and we're still marking that line, that reference line, you know, in between grits, I would still occasionally just check it for flatness as you go.
Sure.
And just make sure that you're not trying to take out, you know, you're not creating a divot here or a divot on the edges or sanding the edges off. And you know, anything you can do to try and maintain control while you're sanding. Now, this takes a little bit of time to go through all those grits, but the real advantage is we didn't have to run this through a drum sander or a planer or anything like that. So pretty nice to be able to use a random orbit sander to finish it.
Well, it turned out pretty nice. I know I had a bunch of questions as we were doing this, and he answered them as we went along. I hope we've been able to do that for you. And I hope that if you build a river table, that you're as successful as we were. It was a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoy yours as well.